Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be taking a look at the future of work because there's so much uncertainty today. We talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about robotics replacing humans, and a myriad of other challenges. And we're looking at what the United Nations International Labor Organization is doing. In fact, they just produced a recent report. It was produced by the Global Commission on the Future of Work, Work for a Brighter Future. And we're going to be talking about that very, very shortly. My guest today is the Director of the International Labor Organization's Research Department, Dr. Damian Grimshaw. Dr. Grimshaw, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into your report, very interesting report and very timely, and one that touches probably everybody on the planet at some point in their lives. Yeah. But let's talk a little bit briefly about the United Nations International Labor Organization, commonly called ILO. When was it formed? Why was it formed?
So the International Labor Organization was formed in 1919, so 100 years ago. So this year is a very special year. We're celebrating the centenary. And 1919, you know, it was an interesting historical era, the end of the First World War, and a real urgent desire, I think, for peace, for permanent peace around the world. And the ILO was set up with a constitution that said that it should really try to deliver social justice with a focus on improving rights and conditions at work as a really important mechanism for improving social justice. And with social justice, you get the basis for everlasting peace all around the world. So that's the ILO, and it's interesting because it's tripartite. So in fact, it's a UN agency, but it's the only UN agency that's tripartite. So it brings together unions, employers, governments, in a way that's still going strong. So it means that all the different labor standards and conventions we agree within the ILO are done on the basis of consensus. So sometimes it takes time, but it means that once that consensus has been reached, people are committed to it, and it's sustainable and lasting.
It is very important to bring all the players, the three key stakeholders into the discussion, because if you have a three-legged stool and one leg is missing, you're not going to be able to make the other two stand up on their own, that's for sure. But that's important. You mentioned 1919 too. That was 1918, the end of World War I, 1919, the founding of the League of Nations, which eventually went away and the United Nations replaced it. But the ILO is still here. It's still a major specialized agency in the United Nations system. Is doing a remarkable job, I think, covering a myriad of topics. And our viewers can go, we can't get to all of them today, but they can go to www.ilo.org to get more information. There are also four underpinnings, if you will, or pillars for the ILO, four philosophical underpinnings. What are those briefly?
Yeah, so we have four pillars. It's a way of organizing our work and activities because there's a lot of work. There's 187 member states signed up to the ILO as member states. And they all come with their, like if you like, the three-legged stool. They all come with their unions, employers, and governments. And across these different countries, these 187 countries, we have programs of decent work which focus on these four strategic objectives. So one is applying fundamental principles and rights at work. So that means saying no to child labor, ending forced labor, ending discrimination at work, and providing freedom for association. It also means providing productive and sustainable employment opportunities. So a lot of work is in the informal economy. So the idea is to invest in jobs that are in the formal economy or help transitions out of the informal economy into the formal economy. It also means working with small and medium-sized enterprises and entrepreneurs. Another pillar or another strategic objective around the Decent Work Programme focuses on social protection. So social protection is very important because at the ILO we have a sort of, if you like, a philosophical ethos that labour isn't a commodity, just to be bought and sold with no sort of rights or nothing else going on outside of work. But of course we know that we need protections outside of work for unemployment, for disabilities, for old age, sickness and so on. So social protection is another important objective. And the fourth is to give rights to collective representation and so collective bargaining, but also simply the freedom to express your concerns at work. And often that's missing or absent in many sectors in many countries.
It certainly is, yes. Yeah. We will get into that in a greater detail. And again, I mentioned at the opening that you have the Global Commission on the Future of Work, Work for a Brighter Future. Well, first off, what is the commission? When was it started? And then we'll find out what it did.
Yeah, so quite some time ago now, the Director General, I think it was about 4 years ago, had the idea to work towards this centenary year and have an important report that talks about the future of work. Now, since then, we've seen lots and lots of reports on the future of work. This is quite different. So he set up a global commission, which is independent of the ILO, actually. So it hasn't gone through the usual channels within this UN agency. It's independent. It brought together 27 commissioners. It's chaired by the Swedish Prime Minister, Prime Minister Löfven, and the President of South Africa, President Ramaphosa. So it brings a real political weight and clout. It's a very interesting commission to watch.
A lot of heft there.
Yeah, a lot of heft. And the other commissioners are kind of interesting as well. They're from business, from unions, from NGOs. They represent co-ops among farmers in India, Oxfam. So it's a whole range of opinions and views. But they all came with this sort of passion to say something about future of work. On all the different things that I'm sure we'll be talking about now. So a really fascinating group of people. So I was in the technical secretariat on the ILO side, providing some of the research behind it, but they were the ones really with the vision. So it was really fascinating.
It certainly sounds like. Well, let's jump into it. What were some of the issues that you dealt with? And we'll talk about the recommendations on how we can deal with these problems. But what are some of the major ones? Let's start off with the one that you think is one of the most important.
Yeah, so I think if I think back to the first meeting of the Global Commission, they wanted to deal with the issues that everybody's talking about, right? So they wanted to talk about technological change. So they were concerned about the rise of artificial intelligence. They were concerned about the gig economy. Not only the gig economy that we see outside in the street, the Ubers or the Chinese Didi, which is the sort of Chinese equivalent of Uber, but also the invisible gig economy. So people who are doing these online tasks for Amazon Mechanical Turk or Crowdflower or Clickworker, Microworker, all these different sites. And there was a concern that technology has gotten ahead of the regulatory instruments that we generally rely upon. So we're not providing the social protections and the usual protections in work for these for millions and millions of workers. We don't even know how many there are. So there was that. That was one big set of issues. Another big set of issues was about about climate change, which is, of course, really important for the environment and so on, but it has massive implications for work. Not only because many people might be losing their jobs if they're living in the coastal regions of Vietnam, for example, where they expect, I think it's around 7% of the agricultural land to go once the sea levels rise by about a meter. So how do you protect those people who are losing their jobs, their livelihoods, but also how do you protect people who have to go from dirty industries into clean industries? A lot of that work happens in developing countries because we've sort of offshored dirty industries decades ago. And they were also concerned about demographic change. In fact, I'd say that was one of the most important concerns in the Global Commission. So we had a commission from Japan. Japan's now known as really having the oldest population on Earth. 28% of people are 65 years old and older. But all countries are seeing an aging population. And this was of great concern. How do we finance pensions? How do we invest in a care economy? All these kinds of issues. So it wasn't just the sort of if you like, the narrow concerns of robotics, artificial intelligence. They had a wide agenda, which made it really challenging, but also interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, let's start off. I'm sure we'll get into others too.
Yeah.
And the ones you mentioned are just critical, especially climate change. This is a game changer across the board. Every industry, every person on this planet is being affected now and will be more adversely affected in the future, according to the scientists who are studying it. What sort of recommendations did you come up with to try to help? We're probably never going to stop climate change, but is there some way we could slow it down or deal with it, adapt to it to some degree? But what sort of recommendations did you come up with just for that one particular problem, which is, in the eyes of many experts, the number one problem in the world?
Yeah. So I think we tried to take throughout the report a sort of a critical realist view with an optimistic set of scenarios where we're building recommendations. So on climate change, we identify the green economy as one major area of investments that all countries need to play a part in. I think we recognize as well that some level of international cooperation and international financing will be necessary, because it's kind of a bit of a perverse thing with the environmental problems that most of the problems and disasters and crises are occurring in developing countries, even though we feel them in all the countries. It seems a bit strange that the wealthy countries that are producing most of the sort of human-generated climate change are sort of exporting a lot of the problems, right, to developing countries, which will be more at risk of sea rise changes and so on. So we call for what the ILO refers to as a just transition. And that means that when workers and people with families and communities having to move locations and move jobs, that it's protected. It's a protected transition with the right skill programs and the right social protection. And that's very important. So we're not saying that this should be just a sort of a free-for-all, that the market will allow this thing just to work out. We don't think it will. So we need sort of smart interventions, and these need to be internationally coordinated.
Did the report talk about what can be done to help provide more incentives to people to develop green economies, clean technologies, to get away from fossil fuels, all of them, especially coal, and move as fast as possible away from them, and to get into solar or wind or whatever it may be? But are there types of incentives that were mentioned, such as a carbon tax or things like that?
Yeah, so there's a lot about incentives in the report, because we figured that all the things we were calling for, if we just stay with the same rules of the game, what's going to change? If we're still just chasing GDP growth, or companies are still chasing the next quarterly balance sheet, then we need to change this. So the commissioners were agreed on wanting to say something about the rules of the game. So if we have more long-term incentives, it helps companies. Companies are crying out to make the right kinds of sustainable investments, but they just can't do it because they don't get the investment backing for these long-term investments. So we call for longer-term investments for financing, and we also say for countries and the international institutions that monitor GDP growth to stick with GDP growth, because it's a good harmonized measure. It tells us a lot about a country's economy. But also to try and we hope the ILO will do the work on this, but to try and establish alternative measures that speak to the needs of a sustainable development agenda. So something that is able to take into account what people call externalities or spillovers. So the adverse effects on the environment somehow can be counted, right, as part of a country's well-being and contribution to environmental sustainability. Yeah, so the report talks to all those things. Yeah,
it's very important to do that, to have a real myriad of initiatives there, and to look at all the different causal effects and what are some of the reasons or some of the possibilities of overcoming this particular problems. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you like our shows and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact us locally. Today we're taking a look at the future of work, and the future of work is changing quite dramatically because of artificial intelligence, because of climate change, because of many other reasons. And my guest today is someone who's going to bring us up to date on a very interesting study. And the study that the ILO, the International Labor Organization, has done is from the Global Commission on the Future of Work, Work for a Brighter Future. My guest is Dr. Damian Grimshaw, and Dr. Grimshaw is the director of the International Labor Organization's Research Department in Geneva, Switzerland. We're talking about climate change, and you mentioned GDP, the gross domestic product, and the short-sightedness of so many companies. They're chasing stockholders. They're trying to get as much of a share, a premium to their shareholders, stockholders, as they can, and they lose sight of the big picture. And how can we change that mentality? It seems that we're moving more towards that, or we have been over the last 20 or 30 years, whereas years ago, a lot of corporations were much more socially responsible, shall we say. And many are today. I'm not saying they're not. Yeah. But how can we change that mentality? Do you talk to the business people, explain to them how you need to broaden that that fan of variables that you look at to see how well you're doing?
No, I think that's important. I think it's important to realize that the business community is doing a lot itself to move in this direction. So there's a lot of concern now to have social environmental reporting. And while many companies may just do the sort of minimum on this with a couple of pages in their annual reports, many are really pushing to advance this agenda. So a lot of businesses want to be responsible, want to serve the needs of their communities. And so we're trying to build on that and use that as a catalyst for further conversations. So, the IMF is very concerned about the amount of wealth that's been offshored into so-called shell companies. Many industries aren't making the long-term investments they need for innovations in products and processes, and we're seeing declining rates of investment around the world. And from an employment perspective, we're not seeing the long-term investments in skills and in people as assets for companies. So the report also calls for kind of a critical look at accounting standards, because it's strange in many companies, you want to make an investment in training, it's a cost. And you go to your finances and ask for the capital to fund this, and they won't, because it's seen as a cost, and also you can't really guarantee that it's going to get you that extra productivity. So by making humans, if you like, human labor an asset in a company, you see it as an investment with a long-term return, which is as good as your management strategy, right? But it's there on the table. So we talk about these things too. Yeah.
There was a term used in there, time sovereignty.
Yeah.
What exactly is that?
Yeah, so time sovereignty. So the ILO, from its very, very birth in 1919, has always been on the working hours issue, maximum working hours, right? So it's something we've really fought for, campaigned for across all countries. And most countries have some legislation on maximum hours. But we know from the data there's still big problems with excessive hours. But there's also this other weird thing, which is coming up more and more and more in country surveys, which is saying that people, the thing about hours is more that people want some control over when they work, or some regularity, or at least some say, some ability to negotiate, right? I don't know, me and you might be able to negotiate our shifts or our hours or the weekend work and the evening work, but increasingly many people don't have that right or are fearful to really, really ask for that, because they might be afraid they won't get the next round of overtime or the next better promotion or whatever. So working time sovereignty is really the idea that people have a right to negotiate their scheduling of work. So there seems to be a rise in on-call, casual work, and it's a bit of a resistance to that, if you like. At least to try and balance out this conversation about working hours.
Now, we mentioned artificial intelligence, AI, and we're starting to see read a flood of articles and see specials done on AI, and it seems that the artificial intelligence is coming online much faster than a lot of the experts predicted 10 or 15 years ago. I remember reading an article not long ago, said within like 15 years, 40% of all the jobs today will be gone. They will be replaced by robots, or what, are they eliminated or folded into other jobs or whatever. That is frightening to a large degree, because we have 7.6 billion people on the planet now. We're going to have about 9.5 in 2050. How will we deal with this if the jobs are shrinking? Now, not everybody can be a robotics repair person. It just isn't going to work. And somebody has to have the money to buy all the cars and the widgets that are coming offline. How do we deal with that? I'm sure we got the answer right here, but how do we do that?
So you're sounding a little bit pessimistic.
Just a little.
There were some on the commission who were relatively pessimistic. I think the bulk of them wanted to have a more optimistic scenario. So we report there the McKinsey reports and others that you're referencing, where they talk about the numbers of jobs that'll go, that'll come, they'll be destroyed, that'll be created, and so on. The commissions were very clear from the beginning. They didn't want to just talk about numbers of jobs. They wanted to talk about what's happening to work. And so they were far more interested in how artificial intelligence and robotics and technologies were changing how work is defined and what it means to people. So if you take, for example, in elderly care, the Japanese are making these robots that help the jobs of a care worker. So that might take away some jobs, but it's certainly transforming the nature of care work. And so what we're saying here is that if that robot is going to adjust the kind of tasks a care worker does, what the care worker needs is some ability to negotiate that redefined job. So we talk about job crafting in the report, and we say that if workers and robots or cobots, these robots that
Cobots.
Collaborate with workers, right? The cobots. If that's going to work in a way that advances human development, because that's essentially what we're concerned with a human-centered agenda for development. If that's going to happen, workers need to have that ability to influence how their job is going to be changed. So we don't know how many jobs are going to be destroyed or created, but we do know that these jobs are going to be changing. And the other big areas, artificial intelligence is, the use of algorithms in shaping work is really huge. And so there's a big sort of concern that algorithms, for example, that are used by HR managers for recruitment, that they build in biases. You've probably read about this stuff, that they build in gender biases and race biases, because they go on sort of average stats for black versus white applicants or male versus female applicants, and they use these averages to weed out people on the basis of their gender or the race or ethnicity and so on, and that can cause real problems. So we call for actions at countries and sector levels to weed out and root out biases in algorithms. We're behind on the regulations on this, and I think that needs looking at. Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. This is an exciting time, and it's also one that we have to kind of know what we're getting into as we move into it and deal with these issues as they come up. There are a couple of other items that just sprang to mind a minute ago, and I think about labor unions. Labor unions have been an integral part of the International Labor Organization as far as the tripartite situation, and we've seen really a gutting of labor unions, especially in the United States and some other countries around the world. But at the same time, we've seen just this huge chasm of income inequality. Years ago, we used to say, well, look at South America, look how big it is. Now they say, look at North America, look at the United States in particular. How serious are these two problems as far as really eliminating the purchasing power and the strength of the middle class, because the labor unions really created the middle class, in my opinion, to a large degree. But how did you deal with the income inequality and the minimalization of labor union power?
I mean, I think I would agree with you that I think one of the strongest variables in explaining the rise and high levels of inequality is the strength of trade unions, but also their ability to work with employers and forge collective agreements. So when we track the share of workers that are covered by collective agreements that set wages and pensions and working hours and so on, that coverage correlates pretty well with levels of equality. So the higher the coverage, the more people are covered by unions and agreements, the lower the wage inequality in the country. But the other problem with inequality in general these days is inequality by wealth. And this is just something we're only now really beginning to understand, because there's a bunch of people in Paris who have collected really, really good wealth data using tax records. So we now know just how much the concentration of wealth far exceeds any other kind of indicator of inequality by wages and so on. So it's a real problem. And I agree with you that I think trade unions, if they're revitalized, reinvigorated, and supported by statutory rules in countries, because often they're not, if they're supported in that way, and also if they're able to mobilize the many billions of informal workers, then we have a chance, right? But there's so much to do. But it also goes, this sort of collective representation goes on the employer side too, because there's also a concern, take the gig economy, there's a concern that there's so much power concentrated in just a handful of companies, which might tell us that we're doing wonderful things, but there's a sort of a social responsibility for employers to represent themselves, to have that diversity of interests, so that small and medium-sized enterprises and multinationals all have a seat at the table and are able to say what's their concern. So we need more. It might be the sort of old-fashioned view of the ILO, but we do need more collective representation on both sides, so that we get this diversity of interests. I think that's as necessary now as ever.
It certainly is. And hardest question in the last 30 seconds, as you look at the future of work, what do you see as the number one challenge as you move into this and explore in greater detail your recommendations, and I'm sure expand upon them?
Well, so I'm going to say the one thing that we haven't talked about, which is, so one of the 10 recommendations there, and you can go online and see the 10 recommendations, is a call for a transformative agenda for gender equality. Right? So one of the persistent legacy problems in the world of work has been that women face more disadvantages at work than men. And feminist economists would argue that if you tackle the problems that women face, you're indirectly solving a lot of other problems too, right? So most women are, or they've got a higher risk of low wages or unemployment. Tackle those problems and you're helping everybody. So I would want to highlight that one particular recommendation.
And I'm glad you brought that up and got it in. But
Good.
Dr. Damian Grimshaw, this is an extremely important report that you've done, the Work for a Brighter Future, under the Global Commission on the Future of Work. And of course, we recommend to all of our viewers to go to www.ilo.org, because these events are taking place. They're taking place whether we want them to or not. It makes no difference. Yeah. They're well underway, and we really have to deal with them. We have to deal with climate change. We have to deal with artificial intelligence. We have to deal with the race to the bottom with many businesses that want to just keep offshoring and get the cheapest labor possible. And these are all issues that are very, very important, and they have affected our lives up to this point, and they will certainly affect our lives as we move into the future. But I want to thank you so very much for being with me today, and thank you for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Pleasure. Great to be here.
Thanks
very much.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.